This is a pretty dire story. This is a pretty big picture story here. CNBC reports the wealth of the 1% just hit a record $44 trillion. That's right. $44 trillion is now the net worth of the richest 1% of Americans. The wealth of the top 1% hit a record $44.6 trillion at the end of the fourth quarter as an end-of-year stock rally lifted their portfolios, according to new data from the Federal Reserve. The total net worth of the top 1%, defined by the feds as those with wealth over $11 million, increased by $2 trillion in the fourth quarter. All of the gains came from their stock holdings. The value of corporate equities and mutual fund shares held by the top 1% surged to $19.7 trillion from $17.65 in the previous quarter. While their real estate values went up slightly, the value of their privately held businesses declined, essentially canceling all other gains outside of stocks. The quarterly gain marked the latest addition to an unprecedented wealth boom that began in 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic market surge. Since 2020, the wealth of the top 1% has increased by nearly $15 trillion, or 49%. Middle-class Americans have also seen a rising wealth tide, with the middle 50 to 90% seeing their wealth increase 50%. Well, that's nice. Now, it's going to show you this chart here.
You got city hands, Mr. Hooper. Counting money all you like.
Starting with the CARES Act, right at the beginning of the lockdowns, that was described accurately as the largest upward transfer of wealth in the history of the world. And as you can see here,
I just don't understand why so many of these Trump voters hate democracy.
Yeah, they really hate democracy. Look at that. Look at that payola there between 2020 and 2024. However, if you notice, there was a slight bump there where it went slightly down, as has happened from time to time. But while you could certainly blame a lot of this on that CARES Act, on the way that wealth was consolidated during the pandemic, how the lockdowns harmed a lot of small businesses and made Amazon the go-to for just about every household, right? It would be narrow-minded to put all the blame there, because look at this. Right before 2010, so what would be, according to this graph, that would be 2008, the net worth of the top 1% was around $15 trillion, which means it's tripled in the last 14 years since we elected Barack Obama, the man of the people, hope and change, right? Everybody's going to get a shot. Since then, the net worth of the richest 1% of people has tripled over that period of time. Just so you know, folks, the GDP of the United States, which is the richest country on earth, $25 trillion, which means you could make the case quite aptly that the richest 1% of people literally, in a sense, own this country almost 2 times over. Their net worth is twice that of the GDP of the entire country, and it has tripled over the last 14 years. Again, you talk about why do Trump voters hate democracy? Well, look at that window of time between 2008 and 2016. A steady increase. It almost doubled over that period of time. From over 15 to just about halfway between 25 and 30. That was under President Hope and Change. And then obviously COVID, they made a killing off of that. But this has been a pretty steady increase over the last 14 years. If you analyze politics, and I know people used to make fun of Bernie Sanders for hammering on the 1%, the top 90% goes to the 1%. Okay, yeah, I understand that gets repetitive, boring. But if you don't see this as the main problem with the country, then I don't know what you're looking at. How can you have a society where the richest 1% of people have a net worth that is almost twice the GDP of the entire country? If you don't see every other problem as being downstream of this, you do not have your eyes open. You're going to hate on an immigrant for just, pulling apart chicken carcasses for $16 an hour at a Tyson plant when you got this going on. This is robbery in broad daylight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I just, just to tie it all together, we had a commenter who rightly pointed out this has nothing to do with DEI, what's going on with Boeing. This is really typical of the game. We talk a lot about the game that the left plays to distract using identity politics. We don't talk as much about the right game because we consider it kind of self-evident, but that's the right game. It's not that there's, and I've reported on it, it's not that there's none of that DEI going on inside Delta. I think we covered at this DEI program. It's not that there's none of that going on, but this has nothing to do with it. What we're covering here, the Boeing planes are not falling apart in the sky because of DEI, but the right-wing part of the ecosystem that keeps that line going up in an unbroken trend through both Democrat and Republican administrations. There's not a break there when Trump becomes president. Doesn't all of a sudden go down, keeps going up. The left, so-called left, have their identity politics distractions, and the right have theirs. They don't want you looking at capitalism, so they're going to tell you, oh, all these problems with the planes are DEI. It's not fucking DEI. It's not DEI. That is out of control, unregulated capitalism eating the institutions of the state. So, getting into that with this, it's just complete misdirection. They want you to be mad at the immigrant making $16.50 an hour, and they don't want you looking at this.
Yeah,
that's the right side of the equation.
Absolutely. Economists say the rising stock market is giving an added boost to consumer spending through what is known as the wealth effect. When consumers and investors see their stock holdings soar, they feel more confident spending and taking more risk. Later in the article, economists say
this part's interesting.
Yeah. Economists say a rising stock market brings outsized benefits to the wealthy, mainly boosting the high end of the consumer and spending markets. The wealth of middle-class and lower-income Americans depends more on wages and home values than stocks. Those houses in the top 1/3 of the income distribution and who own the bulk of the stock holdings account for approximately 2/3 of consumer spending, Zandi said. Liz Ann Saunders, chief investment strategist at Charles Schwab, said stocks represent a growing share of the assets of the top 1%. Stocks accounted for 37.8% of the overall share of household assets for the top 1% at the end of 2023, up from a recent low of 36.5%. Yet because the wealthy don't need to spend as much of their gains, a phenomenon known as the marginal propensity to consume, Saunders said the added stock wealth for the 1% may not have a substantial impact on the consumer economy. She noticed that consumer confidence among those making more than $125,000 a year has been in secular decline since 2017, according to the conference board. While the bump in stock prices might link to stronger confidence, it doesn't necessarily point to stronger spending at the higher end, she said. With the S&P 500 already up 10% this year, it's likely that the wealth of the upper echelon has already topped the record at the end of 2023, while inequality declined slightly in 21 and 22 as wages increased and housing prices surged. The wealth gap has since crept back to pre-pandemic levels. The top 1% accounted for 30% of the nation's wealth at the end of the fourth quarter, while the top 10% accounted for 67% of all wealth. The top 1% accounts for 30% of the nation's wealth, and 67% of all wealth in this country is owned by the top 10.
Yeah. Well, this is why it feels like we live in two Americas, because we do.
Because we do.
Yes. And this is why the conversation among the establishment, and I include the Republican and the Democratic establishment in that equation, is so completely disconnected from everybody else's. Because for them, the system is working. The country is good. So people who really want to upend the system, they're dangerous nut jobs. Come on, man. We've never had it so good. What do you mean? What's wrong with you? Work hard, bootstraps, all that.
Right.
I mean, even Democrats believe that. They just want to give you, a few programs to help you achieve your meritocratic aims. There are no problems, and that's really what Barack Obama represented. It was really the apotheosis of neoliberalism, the neoliberal premise, the idea that there's nothing wrong with the system other than discrimination. As long as you address discrimination against identity groups, the system works just fine. If you wind up not able to feed your kids, well, you should have done better in school. That's what Thomas Frank always talks about. Well, you should have done better in school. The only problem is if people are not allowed to have that opportunity to become a greedy consumer, right? As long as you have the opportunity, no matter what your identity is, the system is fine. If you wind up in poverty, well, you should have gone to Harvard.
And now that student debt is so out of control, I've noticed even the Democrats are backing off that shit a little bit, because Obama, every speech about economic strife had to do, he peppered in somewhere that everybody should, have the opportunity to go to college.
Right,
the implication of that is that, of course, going through the higher education system is the gateway into an economically secure life. And obviously the other implication of that is that if you don't go to college, you're going to be poor, and you're going to deserve to be poor because you didn't go to college. And I've noticed Biden has backed off that a bit. I haven't heard the Democrats talk like that as much in recent years. They still do sometimes, but with Obama, it was literally every speech that had to do with this topic. And they can't go there as much anymore because student debt is out of control, and it's just too obvious to too many people that is a giant scam to so many people who get sucked into it. But when you look at the big picture and you look at the fact that the top 1% of this country literally has a net worth almost twice as high as the GDP, if that is not a political message that you hammer every single time. If I were running for office, if I were forming a party, I would put that in every single speech, because how you can look at any other problem and not consider it downstream of that is just insane. That's obviously the problem.
Well, hey, for all of his failings, as you point out, Bernie did do that, and they destroyed him.
Yeah.
And they destroyed him, and they'll do that to anybody who runs on that, unless they're a right-wing grifter like Donald Trump. Because then he's not going to do anything about it. What did he do? Remember, he was talking about the hedge fund managers. We got to tax the hedge fund managers. He gave them a fucking tax cut. He didn't do shit about the hedge fund managers. Why did that line keep going up? I know we get our MAGA people. Look at that line. All right. Next time you want to tell me how Donald Trump is different, I want to pull up that chart.
Please clap.